All right. Hi, everybody. How are you all doing today? Very good. I guess that means you can also see and hear me. I'm good. I'm feeling a little less sleepy now that we're getting to the end of things. Not that I look forward to when the class ends. It's always kind of bittersweet when I finish a class. But it is nice that the work is winding down. I imagine you feel the same, you know. Uh, The last reflection assignment is due tomorrow, so I'm sure you'll be happy to get that out of the way and focus on the final. By the way, we're almost finished marking the proposals. Um, Looks like we could be done by end of today. We'll definitely be finished by tomorrow, which is the last day of class. And so then you'll have the whole exam period to turn that proposal into the start of your essay and then complete the essay. But for today, what we're going to do is finish off our discussion on, well, the last two chapters of Kim and the three chapters of from Blackmore that I made available. And, I'm going to be riffing again quite a bit. So bear with me. Um, we don't have too much material left to get through. So we might even be able to end class a little bit early. Yeah, before we get started, Liam, what's your question?
So I was reading through Blackmore's chapter about the zombie thought experiment, and he basically gives a proof of how it's illogical to conceive of the zombie world, because if they have to be exactly like us, like the experiment says, then they have to think about consciousness, but they can't think about consciousness because they would never have been introduced to the concept. So does that make it a really good proof in that it like really strongly supports one side, or does that make it a bad proof in that it does favor one side over the other?
Is that Zombie Earth, like Todd
Yeah.
Moody's Zombie Earth? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, really, like, depending on whether you think it's good, um, or rather, how can I put this? I think whether it seems like a good uh, proof uh, of consciousness essentialism really depends on your intuitions about what consciousness is, right? Because after all, that's what these thought experiments are for. The original sort of zombie thought experiment, which Blackmore doesn't really outline in detail, but Kim does, at least Kripke's version of it, right? Where he said, and Kripke is not a naturalist, by the way, which is evident, I think, um, from that quote in, I think it's chapter 10 in Kim, right? Where Kripke sort of says, like, God could have made the world in such a way where all of us are, doing what we do without any inner experience. Um, that's just not what happened, right? Actually, maybe we can find that exact quote and dig into this a little bit more. I'm just going to open up that chapter. But if you don't mind, Liam, and everyone else, you want to dive into this a little deeper?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Okay. Let's go to the readings. Pretty sure it's in chapter 10. Maybe I can just search for Kripke. Right. Okay. So this is from Kripke, quoted in Kim. What about the case of stimulation of C fibers? To create this phenomenon, it would seem that God only create beings with C fibers capable of the appropriate type of physical stimulation. Whether the beings are conscious or not is irrelevant here. It would seem, though, that to make C fiber stimulation correspond to pain or to be felt as pain, God must do something in addition to the mere creation of C fiber stimulation. He must let creatures feel the C fibers as pain, not as a tickle, or as warmth, or as nothing, as apparently would also have been within his powers. Uh, and then Kim continues, if Kripke is right, Kim says, there are two kinds of possible worlds that, though identical with our world in all physical respects, they are different in mental respects. So there are worlds with different physical phenomenal correlations. And second, there are those in which there are no phenomenal mental events at all, zombie worlds. Um, so, and that's a pretty good highlight, I think, of consciousness inessentialism as explained by Blackmore, right? Consciousness is an inessential extra. If you buy what Kripke is selling here, and I don't, um, because I am a naturalist, then zombies are conceivable. And what Zombie Earth is aimed at showing is that even if you think zombies are conceivable as individual sorts of entities, these differences would, the differences in how they talk about inner experiences would become apparent on Zombie Earth because it would be obvious that they have no idea what they're talking about. And it sounds, Liam, like you are thinking along the same lines as Moody, right? Is that what you were saying earlier? Like, is this why this is an excellent proof, or why it seems to be an excellent proof? Um, well, this is at least what it's trying to show. Whether you buy it or not depends on your intuitions. You might be inclined toward dualism, like Kripke, or perhaps to some kind of substance monism, like physicalism, naturalism, like many contemporary philosophers.
So, like, my question was more along the lines of, does the quality of the thought experiment get diminished by having a logical proof against the conception of the zombie world?
I don't think so. What logical is the logical proof that little
Well,
argument about
like zombies have no reason to be able to conceive of consciousness in the first place, so how would they talk about it? But they have to talk about it for it to be an identical world, and therefore there's a mix up of like truths there.
yeah, again, I think it really depends. Like if we go back a few slides, um, some are just going to think that this whole thing is wrong-headed, like the Churchlands. Um, Dennett maybe has something else to say about zombies. Not Dennett obviously doesn't think that thought experiments are misguided, but yeah, it's there's no right or wrong answer here. Um, you could certainly formulate a convincing argument, though, that these this zombie society where they talk about mentality um, could not exist. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Yeah.
like it can't exist by virtue of itself.
So if that's your inclination, it sounds like well, it sounds like you're saying not only are zombies not conceivable, but zombie society is not conceivable.
Like I'm able to imagine a zombie,
Hmm.
but then there's also the logical fallacy in the zombie world. So I suppose I can conceive of the individuals, but not how they act.
Oh, okay. And that's fine. That's fine. I'm sorry if I'm not being very helpful. I
I
guess I,
was I was more so curious about like how to make a good thought experiment. Like, does skewing the thing by having a logical argument against one side make it a bad experiment?
it might. And I think that's maybe part of the reason why Churchland, like Patricia Churchland, has a bit of an issue with zombies and zombie Earth, right? Because one point I think we're dancing around here is like, well, how do we know when we have a good thought experiment, firstly? And secondly, how do we know that we're following the rules properly, right? Um, and not only are different people going to have different intuitions as a result of running through the thought experiment, there's going to be disagreement about whether it's a good thought experiment in the first place, whether we followed the rules. Um, As for what makes a good thought experiment, yeah, that's a really tough question to answer. Um, I suppose some thought experiments are superior to others in terms of their formulation. But yeah, they're not perfect tools. So anyway,
Okay, thank
yeah,
you.
I understand. I might not have made anything any more clear there. Um, so apologies if I haven't, but yeah, I'm just if it's me, like if I think through this, like you, I can imagine a zombie. I can imagine a zombie society where the behavior, the verbal and physical behavior amongst all the different zombies is indistinguishable from Earth, but where there is nothing that it's like to be any of those creatures. I can imagine that, but I do kind of think like, yeah, they would, the way they would use words like consciousness or pain or phenomenology would betray the fact that they don't actually understand anything that they're talking about, right? So for me, the intuition I'm led to is not that zombie Earth is impossible, but that zombie Earth would look different than our Earth. But if you're led to the intuition that zombie Earth doesn't make any sense at all, that's fine. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't make sense within the bounds of it having to be the exact same. If you allow it to be different, then yes, it could make sense. So I agree with you in that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, but in the sense that but if you cannot conceive of a world where there are zombies where the zombies' behavior would be verbally indistinguishable from ours when they talk about mentality, yeah, that's a totally legitimate outcome of running this little experiment on yourself. Yeah. But yeah, that was kind of fun to kick off class that way. I always love thinking through a thought experiment again. Thought experiments are fun. But now what I want to do is talk about Cartesian materialism, which Kim does not explicitly discuss. Um, but I think it's worth doing a little bit of a deep dive into because we have encountered some ideas in Kim that are a little bit materialistic in the Cartesian sense. So let me just make sure I'm on the right slide. Yeah, here we go. So do you remember early in the course when we encountered the notion of the mental theater and we were talking about the beetle in the box? Daniel Dennett calls this the Cartesian theater. Yeah. It's a pretty intuitive way of thinking about the mind, right? It's almost like I, myself, my ego, is the audience in the theater. And whatever happens on the stage or on the screen, that's what we're conscious of. But Daniel Dennett, a critic of this notion, thinks there's a problem. There's a sort of dualism that remains, even though we've dispensed with substance dualism by and large in this era or epoch of philosophy. There's um, there's a certain dualism here, right? Most people nowadays are substance monists, so we're physicalists. I suppose there are some idealists, but mostly we're physicalists. And then is a minority that um, are sort of dualistic in the sense that they believe there's a special time and place in the brain where everything comes together, to paraphrase Dennett. Descartes thought that was the pineal gland, right? But nowadays, you actually hear this discussed um, in even in certain discussions concerning AI and producing conscious AI. I remember reading a tweet from Yann LeCun, right, who was the head of AI for Meta. And not that you should regard Twitter as an academic source, obviously, but it went something like, um, in order to make a conscious large language model, what we would have to do is understand and implement something analogous to the part of the brain that's responsible for consciousness. And there is no single part of the brain that's responsible for consciousness. This is actually something that we call the mereological fallacy, which I will actually, this is important. I will put this in the chat. I think I'm spelling it right, but I could be wrong. But it's the fallacy of attributing a function to a part of a system rather than the whole system. Descartes does this with the pineal glands when he says that this is a sort of locus of interaction between the non-physical mind and the physical body. But certain people make this mistake when they say, oh, there's a part of the brain where consciousness is realized, right? That's a mistake. Um, Alternative to the theater model, I also sometimes use the giant robot analogy, right? Which is kind of like what you see depicted here in Blackmore's book. The self is like this little person, a little person, a homunculus, inside of the theater, or in this case, the cockpit. And here, we've got speakers and a television representing sensory information coming in, and we've got these controls that represent actions going out, and we've got this little person in here who is like the self or the mind, right? This is very similar to the notion of the Cartesian theater. But what's the problem? What's the problem with this? That's a problem that I didn't really discuss when we were talking about um, the Cartesian theater and the beetle in the box. That all had to do with solipsism and subjectivity. This has more to do with how we think about consciousness. But what is the problem that I'm gesturing at here with my mouse cursor? Well, that's yeah, where would it be? If you thought that there was that this little guy in here, this self, was realized by a particular part of the brain, I think you would be committing the mereological fallacy again, Leo. So yeah, that's true. But the problem I'm gesturing at is slightly different. Samuel, what do you think?
Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, great. I guess one thing, yeah, yeah. So like nest, like kind of like what he, like Liam. I was just about to say what Liam and Joshua has. Like, what controls the homunculus,
hmm
and like
I
is
think
like it,
you're about to say like nesting dolls.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Nesting dolls,
Yeah,
like
it's
nesting homunculi.
this would be like homunculi all the way down, right?
Yeah,
Nesting homunculi ad infinitum, right? It's an
yeah,
infinite regress. So, and
yeah.
that's the homunculus problem. Yeah, that's exactly right. So, yeah, you all got that. Um, that's the problem with Cartesian materialism. So, Cartesian materialism, in a nutshell, as articulated by Dennett, is this idea that we have abandoned um, Cartesian dualism. Most of us are physicalists or materialists, but we still hold on to this dualistic notion of a little mind sitting in some, special place, um, like this little homunculus in this person's head. And there's still a sort of dualism there. Even though we're not substance dualists, we still think of minds or selves or egos in Cartesian terms. That's Cartesian materialism. And this will be important when we look at theories of consciousness in a moment. I want to touch on something else, this notion of a mental screen, because I think it's or mental stage or mental screen, because I think it's kind of interesting and important. Well, it's interesting and important for a number of reasons. One is that you remember when we started the chapter on behaviorism. Um, we surveyed a couple of different thinkers' ideas on consciousness, and William James famously said that the science of psychology, um, well, it's the study of the mind, including consciousness. I don't remember the quote verbatim, um, but James was an introspectionist, right? He thought that we could introspect into our own minds and understand them that way. And then behaviorism came along and dispelled this idea, right? Where the behaviorists weren't even um, really interested in these sorts of things. They were interested in linking stimuli and response and understanding, how learning works on this sort of either classical conditioning or operant conditioning. Because of the behaviorists, the notion of introspecting, the very idea of introspecting into our minds and understanding them that way went away in psychology. It's still kind of hung around in philosophy a bit. I mean, the phenomenologists, after all, we can't forget about. Actually, come to think of it, it's a little bit criminal that Kim doesn't talk about phenomenology, but phenomenology as a philosophical movement is more closely associated with the continental tradition, and Kim is not working within that framework, so that's probably why he doesn't mention them. But the phenomenologists were sort of, like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty and those thinkers advocated a sort of radical empiricism about the contents of your own conscious experience, where you could basically kind of do something similar to what the introspectionists wanted to do. But yeah, from the more scientific sort of psychology, this stuff was banished by behaviorism until the early 1970s, the cognitive revolution, when Roger Shepard and his colleagues did some really interesting studies on mental imagery. So in a study, we like this one, they would give their participants these pairs of figures, right? And they had to push a button to indicate whether the pairs are the same or different. So if you look at this pair in the pair A, right? It's the same different task essentially. But what you have to do in order to see whether they're the same shape is mentally rotate one of the shapes so that they're oriented the same way. And then you push the button to indicate whether they're the same or the different or different. So let's try this. Is A the same or different? Got to rotate it in your mind's eye. That's right. How about B? It's a little trickier. Are you sure, Hayden? B is the same. What about C? Yeah, C is different. Now, the why this is really interesting? Well, the results showed that the greater the degree of rotation, the longer it took for participants to respond. So we can see A is not rotated very much. It's kind of tilted like this, and if when I do this anyway, I take the second image and I just rotate it like this, and I can see that it's the same. I rotate it up and maybe this way a little bit. B takes me a little longer because I have to spin the thing all the way around. And C, uh, not that rotated, so you can do that quickly. Um, but the average response time was related to the degree of rotation, such that the greater the degree of rotation, the longer it took subjects to respond, whether it was the same or different. And that gave us a way to objectively measure inner experiences. And this was sort of one of the things that kicked off the cognitive revolution in the 70s, where we finally said it's okay to talk about the mental again, right? We don't have to just talk about behavior. I mean, it began before this, but these mental imagery studies were really interesting, right? These discussions hadn't taken place in psychology for a very, very long time. So that's pretty cool. It's almost kind of like what the psychophysicists were doing in the late 19th century when they were articulating these sort of not laws, but effects, or at least, I mean, they do call them laws, but they're not laws in the sense of laws of physics. But there are like law-like relationships between sound pressure and perceived loudness, between luminosity and perceived brightness. The psychophysicists were doing stuff like this, but then with the rise of behaviorism, that kind of stopped. Shepard and Metzler's mental imagery studies brought this back into mainstream discussion. So and it was a and yeah, really cool. uh, I love teaching this stuff. I covered this when I used to teach cognitive science as well. One conclusion we can reach from this, actually, that's quite interesting to me, is that um, these are imagistic representations. So not only can we use some kind of like we can operationalize the study of internal subjective experiences. We can also maybe learn something about the nature of those mental representations. The conclusion that Shepard and Metzler reached was that these mental images are actually encoded imagistically and not digitally. So they actually preserve the physical features of the objects they represent. It's not like the brain is implementing, a bunch of ones and zeros, but rather however our brains are realizing these mental images, they're somehow preserving the physical features. Otherwise, it wouldn't take longer depending on the degree of rotation. That's not to say this is a definite conclusion, though, after all this debate continues. But I think that the takeaway is that we can observe and measure people's inner experiences. Um, But the question is a question I've put on this slide. Where is the mental rotation happening? That's a little more tricky. Um, what experiments like this show us is not that there's a special place or time in the brain where it all comes together. Um, we might mistakenly conclude that when we're imagining and doing this exercise, that this is happening in some kind of theater with us as the audience. Like when you closed your eyes and rotated the images, is that how it seemed to you? Like it seemed to me when I do it, like I don't even have to close my eyes, but I can picture these two shapes and rotate them or rotate one of them. And it seems similar to my visual experience now, where like I'm here and I seem to be taking in this sort of detailed scene around me, as if I were sat in some Cartesian theater or some giant robot, a little homunculus there in the audience, or a little homunculus as a pilot of the giant robot. But just because that's the way it seems, that doesn't mean it's the way it actually works. But I don't know. What do you think? When you do this mental rotation exercise, do you kind of see it with your mind's eye? Or maybe we have some aphantasiacs in the class. Aphantasia is when people lack mental imagery. And mental imagery here is understood broadly, not just images, but could be imagining sounds, imagining tastes. Samuel has a visual representation. Yeah. Well, people have various degrees of mental imagery or the richness of mental imagery. Yeah, smooth rotation. It's not all or nothing, right? It's not like there are people with mental imagery and people without it. There is a degree of the richness of imagery. Actually, this is a little example I learned from Professor Jim Davies in the cognitive science department. He did this exercise with us during a colloquium presentation on one of the applications he was developing in the laboratory of the imagination at the time, trying to get basically a computer program to imagine stuff. And so he did this little example with all of us. Um, oh, so for Leo, it's a jump. That's interesting. Yeah, mine's more of a smooth thing, but yeah. Um, so he did this. He did this example. Um, he asked all of us to imagine a mouse. So I will ask all of you now to imagine a mouse. Just imagine a mouse. Okay, now that you've imagined a mouse, who else or who only imagined a mouse and nothing else? So Leo, when you imagined it, it was just like a mouse just sitting there. Okay. Ah, and Samuel imagined a mouse on a surface, like maybe on the floor. When I did this, I imagined the mouse on the floor and one of those like little cartoon mouse holes. Like, Tom and Jerry. Jerry would come out of the mouse hole and get chased around by Tom, right? Um, Little cartoon style mouse hole. And some people just kind of thought of a mouse but didn't have a mental image of the mouse. It's just to show there's a variance here, right? Oh, interesting. So yours like built up from mouse to like a mouse in a certain context. Yeah, very cool. Uh, yeah, Liam, just the mouse, but then there were other things there, but the mouse was where most of the detail was. Yeah. So again, there's no right or wrong way to imagine a mouse, but this shows us that there are individual differences in terms of the richness of mental imagery. Um, but it seems, right, and this is the takeaway. This is the takeaway. It seems like there's a place that you're imagining the mouse, like the mouse is in your imagination, as if your imagination is the stage. And when you imagine a mouse, there's a mouse on that stage, right? But that's probably not how it actually works. Um, Also, we need to keep in mind that mental rotations can happen unconsciously too. So, for example, when I reach out to pick up this coffee cup, or well, I don't have a car, but when I park my car and I'm rotating the wheel, when I'm unlocking a door, when I'm inserting the key into the lock, what we're actually doing is using unconscious mental rotation. And the reason we know that is because there are two different visual pathways in the human brain. One, which is the dorsal pathway, goes from the occipital cortex, from your visual areas, up until to the parietal cortex, which is where your motor, premotor, and motor areas are. And we don't; those have nothing to do with like conscious perception. Um, that's called the where pathway, or more recently, the how pathway, or vision for action. And then we have another pathway that goes from the visual areas to our temporal lobe, and that's the visual pathway we use to build actual visual representations and to identify objects. So if I have this coffee here, I'll try and represent this as best I can, right? If I have this coffee cup right here in front of me and I'm looking at it, when I reach out to pick it up, it seems to me that it's my conscious visual experience that is guiding the movements of my hand. But it's not. The movements of my hand are guided by the unconscious dorsal pathway, not the ventral pathway. So if I look at this coffee cup and you ask me what it is, and I say that's a coffee cup, I'm relying on the ventral pathway, vision for perception. But if I reach out to pick up the coffee cup, what underwrites that is vision for action, the dorsal pathway. So mental rotations can happen unconsciously because I might reach out and have to rotate my wrist a certain way in order to pick up this cup and or turn the key in a lock or make sure I get the key in the right way and that it's not upside down. And it might seem like it's my conscious visual experience that's guiding that action, but it's not. That's the dual process model of vision. And by the way, the reason why we know it's probably not is because you can actually get a sort of double dissociation here. Think about cases like blind sight. So, who knows about blind sight? Has anyone ever heard of this phenomenon? It sounds pretty contradictory, right? Blindness, well, that's when you can't see. Sight, that's when you can see. So what on earth is blind sight? Anyone hear of this? Well, I'll tell you about it. Oh, in Dungeons and Dragons. Is it like a spell? Yeah, yeah, Leo, you're right. I think Kim does mention it in the readings. Blackmore definitely mentions it. It's sort of a type of sense. Blind sight is when you have I've had a stroke to some of my somewhere along my vision for perception pathway, along my ventral pathway. So I might have a blind spot in my visual field. So I can't actually consciously see anything. But the dorsal pathway is still intact. So we can do interesting things with blind sight patients to show how these two visual streams are separate from one another. Um, for example, you could show a blind-sighted person a human face in their blind spot, in their scotoma. It's called, when you have a blind spot in the visual field, it's called a scotoma. So I could show pictures of people smiling or people sad. And I'm showing it in the blind spot. I'm presenting it in the area of their field of view where the blind sight patient cannot see anything. But something really interesting happens. I'll show them the picture and they say, I can't see anything. Is it smiling or sad? I don't know. If it's a happy face, the patients will unconsciously smile back because of the emotional contagion. And if it's a sad face, they might unconsciously frown. Or we can have a slot. This is another sort of experiment we can do. And we can sit the person so that the slot is in their blind spot. And then we can give them a card and say, put the card through the slot. Now they can't see the slot. Nonetheless, they manage to orient the card the right way and put it in the slot. And there are other sorts of experiments which we can do, but it shows a sort of that these are two different visual pathways that we're dealing with. Um, so um, we know actually, incidentally, thanks to the advent of functional magnetic resonance imaging, that when we are mentally scanning or rotating objects or when we're imagining things, we're actually using the same areas of the visual cortex that we use when we actually perceive those things. The same goes for dreams. Like if you have a dream of a visual scene before you, your visual cortex is going to be nearly as active as it is when you're like actually awake with your eyes open looking at a visual scene. But that's not to say that that's where the experience happens. That's the part of the brain that's realizing part of the experience, but that's not where it's going on. Um, and this is Dennett's kind of caution to us, right? It is tempting to think about all of this in these Cartesian materialistic terms, right? Um, it's a very strong intuition that we all have. Think about it. Um, how do we talk about mental events? Where do we say they happen? We say things like, they happen in the mind, or they happen in my imagination. Like when I was having you rotate the shapes or imagine the mouse, where was that happening? You'd probably say, well, it was happening in my imagination. But this is a mistake, according to Dennett. If this were how it worked, then you've got this eye in your mind observing things happening on the stage or the screen, and you run into the homunculus problem, right? Because after all, it's like the nesting dolls or homunculus all the way down, homunculi all the way down. This inner you must have its own mind, and that must have its own mind ad infinitum, right? So that can't be how it works. But some thinkers deny there is actually a regress happening here. So Christoph Koch and Francis Crick, for example, they think that instead of a homunculus problem, what we've got are different parts of the brain looking at the outputs of other parts of the brain. which might, they say, give rise to the illusion of a homunculus in the head looking at the sensory activities of the brain. And there is some intuitive appeal to this, right? I know we haven't talked a lot about neuroscience in this class, but if you ever get the chance to take a neuroscience course, one of the things that you will observe is that the sensory parts of the brain tend to be toward the back. So the visual areas are in the occipital cortex, which is on the back of your brain. Um, and then we've got audition and memory in the temporal areas, which are actually right here. Motor outputs up at the top in the parietal lobes, and then the frontal lobe is perhaps an observer of some kind, looking at some of the outputs from the sensory systems, and then doing other things like relaying it to other areas. That's actually more what the thalamus does, but if Crick and Koch's idea is correct, then the sort of illusion of a Cartesian theater might just reflect the way our brains are organized. But even if that's the case, we still have to explain how the brain looks at itself, right? I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that Crick and Koch's idea solves the regress problem? Like, say there are frontal parts. My frontal parts are looking at the outputs from my sensory systems. Does that solve the problem? I'm curious to hear what you think before I tell you what I think. It might help. Okay, Samuel. Yeah, might help. Yeah, Leo, that's kind of what I think. Like a back and forth conversation. What if the frontal cortex is also observing itself? And what if other bits are observing what the frontal cortex is doing, right? We have this area in the brain called the thalamus, and the thalamus seems to be kind of like a big relay station between all the different parts of the brain, different parts of the cortex. We call these corticothalamic loops or thalamocortical loops. And so maybe it's not like one bit of the brain is looking at another bit of the brain, but it's a sort of, like Leo said, a sort of conversation back and forth between many parts of the brain. And maybe some of those parts, like Hayden says, are observing other parts, but also what's going on internal to those parts. This is very much an oversimplification, but I like to say that consciousness arises out of all of these processes working in concert with one another. Like the music of a symphony literally arises because all the instruments work in concert with one another. That's what the mind is like. That's what I think. And I think Dennett believes something similar. Um, so I want to take a quick break shortly, but I think maybe we'll try and get through this slide and a few more slides. Why is this such a tempting intuition? Well, first of all, do you agree that the Cartesian theater is a tempting intuition? It seems that our mind works that way, I think is how we're meant to take this. Like it seems to us that we are that ourselves, our minds are the pilots of our flesh robot bodies, or that we are the audience in the mental theater. Samuel agrees. Yeah. I think it's tempting. I certainly do. Yeah. Josh, yeah, it seems intuitive. Seems intuitive to me. And I think that's why we talk about the mind being in the head and thoughts being in the mind, right? Imaginings being in the imagination. When we talk about how we forget things, we say mostly I don't remember, but we could also put it like, it's gone from my memory. It's no longer in there. But the mind isn't the sort of thing that things are in. So why is it so appealing, right? Oh, one more. Yeah, yeah. It an inner observer, an inner ego, a Cartesian sort of ego, right? A Cartesian sort of self. Oh, it doesn't seem right. Oh, okay. So Liam, okay. So are you saying, do you not find it intuitive? Like, is it, no, I don't think this isn't how it seems to me. Or is it intuitive, but you don't think that's how it works? Oh, interesting. Interesting. Okay, well, that's fair. Yeah, with when it comes to myself, I think it is actually intuitive, but I do think it's misleading. And I don't think that's how it works. But yeah, that's really cool. Um, okay, yeah. It's a tempting intuition for a lot of people, but not everybody, right? Um, let's ask why we're aware of some things and not others, of some actions, of some beliefs and some desires, but not others. It's got to be connected to brain activity, right? If we're physicalists, if we're naturalists, it's got to be connected to brain activity. So what is the difference maker here? What makes the difference between something being conscious and unconscious, right? A good example. This is the one that Blackmore uses, and Kim uses it as well. But driving, automatic driving. It sometimes happens that we get in the car and head off somewhere, and then all of a sudden we've got there, and we don't remember many of the details of the trip. Maybe because we were listening to the radio or talking with a friend or just lost in thought. But if something were to happen, perhaps if a car were to suddenly stop in front of you or an animal were to run out on the road, you could consciously take over and intervene in order to avoid the car or the animal, right? What makes you go from a more conscious awareness of what is happening from a less conscious one? I'm not going to say you're completely unconscious when you were driving. That would be crazy. Although there is a case where uh, somebody with somnambulism, sleepwalking, got in a car, drove to his in-laws' house, and murdered his mother and father-in-law or something like that. I think he was found not criminally responsible because he was sleepwalking when he did it, but there's a case of unconscious driving if there ever was one. But when you're driving, you're not completely unconscious, but you're a bit less conscious of what's going on. Yeah, I don't know too many details about the case. I think it happened in Canada. Um, actually, let's look. I feel like a streamer. Whenever I dip away from the slides and go to Google something, I feel like I'm a streamer instead of a professor. But like, let's check it out. Let's Google it. Seem Canadian. The case of the murder while sleepwalking. There's an AI overview. Hmm, should we read it? I don't know. Yeah, he could only unconsciously express it because his conscious mind couldn't handle the politeness anymore, Liam. Yeah, okay, Wikipedia. You know what? I always go with Wikipedia over the AI summary. Um, yeah, went to the Supreme Court on the decision of the criminal automatism defense. So yeah, in the early morning of May 24th, 1987, Kenneth Parks drove 20 kilometers from Pickering to Scarborough. He entered their house with a key, used a tire iron to bludgeon his mother-in-law to death. Wow. Tried to choke his father-in-law, covered in blood. He got back in his car and drove straight to a nearby police station and confessed, saying, "I think I've just killed two people." He argued that he was automatistic and not criminally liable. From the doctor's evidence, just to highlight here, It was determined that the accused was sleepwalking at the time of the incident and that he was suffering from a disorder of sleep rather than neurological, psychiatric, or other illnesses. Five neurological experts also confirmed that he was sleepwalking during the time of the incident. The jury acquitted Parks. And then it sounds like it went to the Supreme Court on appeal. That is wild, right? That's absolutely wild. Don't repress your feelings. Yeah. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk to a therapist. Don't wait until it gets into a sleepwalking murder situation. Um, but here's the real kicker, right? Uh, so that was the automatic. He used an automatism defense. Most of what's going on in the mind is automatic. So you might think, how could he have done this without being consciously aware? Think of all the things you do all the time without any conscious, at least if, even if you have conscious awareness, you're not consciously in control of every step of the process. Yeah, Liam, I've heard that too, right? We're so polite, but if you look at for example, Canadians in the First and Second World War, I wouldn't want to fight us. Um, But most of what we do, most of what our minds do is unconscious and automatic. Yeah, yeah, yeah. War crimes. Um, yeah, yeah. Like it's a good example of automaticity, Josh. Typing or playing a game. Yeah, and that's why when you learn to type. I don't know if you do this anymore, but in elementary school and high school, when I was going through school, we were taught to type. I don't know if maybe you just grew up typing. I don't know if they still have that. Do you still have that in school? Typing class? Leo used a weird typing game with a goat. Interesting. Yeah, we learned like okay, thumb on the in grade three. Yeah, we did it in high school. When I was in grade three, we had only a few computers. Most were in the library, and it was when you started the computer and it didn't automatically go into Windows. It booted up into DOS, and you had to like load Windows. Um, I'm showing my age here. Yeah, Liam, Josh, yeah, like they tried to teach me, but I kind of have my own way. I don't use all. You're supposed to use all finger. I predominantly use these and then sometimes my ring fingers. I don't type properly, but the way I've learned to type works for me, right? Um, but when you're learning to type and you're trying to learn it the proper way and you're like, where's this letter again? And you have to like look at it. But now, even if I were to say name all of the keys in order, most of us might not get them all right. But if I ask you to type a message out on the computer, you're going to do it no problem. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'm not alone. But yeah, like if I asked you without looking at your keyboard, name all of the keys, starting from the QWERTY part, like from QWERT on and on, line by line, typewriter style till you get to the end, you might not be able to do it. But if I asked you just to type a message, you can do it. That's automaticity. That's unconscious mental representations at work. Riding a bike is another example. When you first learn to ride a bike, it's tough. But 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 then when you become an expert bike rider, you don't have to think about it. In fact, if you do think about it, you might fall off your bicycle, right? Because you're going to be shifting cognitive resources around in such a way that could interfere with your riding of the bicycle. Or, I think the other example that Josh mentioned was playing a game. I when I was in grad school, I hadn't played video games for years, right? And the last system I had really, other than the odd PC game, but the last video game console I used was the GameCube. Um, The last one I regularly played on was the Nintendo 64. So yeah, again, I'm kind of showing my age a little bit. And then one day I thought to myself, you know what? I'm buying myself a PlayStation. And I sucked at video games for a while because I had to like learn the layout. I'm like, what? Two joysticks? The action button is not where Nintendo puts it. Ah, and I was like, I was having to like think my way through what buttons I was pushing. Now I don't have to do that. But that's automaticity, right? Um, what makes the difference? It can't be that something is on the stage or not on the stage, or on the screen or not on the screen, because there is no mental theater. That's just how our minds make it seem to us. So, what are some alternatives? Well, let's look at some alternatives after we take a quick break. How about that? What do you say? 10 minutes? Do we want to do 10 minutes? Why did I do that? There. I have 3:31 here on the oven, on the little oven clock. Do you want to come back at 3:41? No one's answering. What if you've all taken off already? Okay, Samuel says sure. That's what we'll do then. Let's do a 10-minute break and we'll come back and we'll talk about some alternatives to the theater hypothesis. Okay, see you shortly. Okay, let's pick it up again with some alternatives or possible alternatives to the Cartesian theater. Um, one is global workspace theory. It's actually based on a sort of theater analogy. Um, and it's discussed a little bit by Kim. The architecture of a global workspace is discussed a little bit in the last two chapters of Kim. But the idea is, and this is due to Bernard Bars, that consciousness results in a sort of global broadcast of whatever's in the sort of spotlight of attention to all kinds of other non-conscious mechanisms or processes, what have you, right? And these are backstage in this theater metaphor. The spotlight is meant to be analogous with attention. Bits of the stage correspond to working memory. Here's a sort of representation of it. So we have whatever's in the spotlight shining on the stage of working memory is what we're conscious of. And that's because that's being broadcast to all these other areas, like our memory. There's automatisms, systems that related to action, systems related to categorization, right? So that's the idea. And Bernard Bars actually thinks that Dennett's worries about the Cartesian theater are a little bit misplaced, right? And Bars is, if we're interpreting Bars charitably, there's no special time and place in this global workspace where it all comes together. It doesn't all come together here, right? But this is important. But what's also important is a sort of global broadcast of whatever is in the spotlight to the rest of the system. Um, Here, consciousness is almost emergent. Emergent in the sense that it emerges because all of these different systems, as I said earlier, are working in concert with one another. Bars does think that maybe there's something like a convergence zone, um, and that's where this global workspace is realized, but it's not exactly a stage or a screen, right? It's more like kind of almost similar to the higher order thought or higher order perception theories that I mentioned last time. Um, the visual system, for example, is a bit like a staircase where you have very low level processes that detect things like the contrast between light and dark, edges, and so forth. Then you get up to more detailed representations, and then you get up to like full blown mental representations that we're conscious of, right? So at the top of the staircase, Blackmore writes, the brain regions for object uh, recognition, that's where they are, and they appear to be where the contents of consciousness emerge. So it's a hierarchical information processing chain. And up at the top is where we get things that we are conscious of. Um, this, again, is an idea you find in a lot of others' work. I wonder if you've taken a cognitive science course for any of you who are here today. There's only 10 of us. But have any of you learned about David Marr's levels of analysis of the visual system? It's from his book, A Computational Analysis of Vision, something like that. It's a long time since I've read that book. Well, Marr's important contribution was this sort of were stages of not were was what we call the tri-level hypothesis, which is looking at different levels of analysis. But in illustrating this hypothesis, which isn't really important for our purposes, he uses the visual system, which creates what he calls a primal sketch, a 2.5D sketch, and a 3D sketch. So it's this hierarchical sort of information processing, which goes from the primal sketch, which is like light, dark, edges, outlines, to a 2.5D sketch, which is a little more detailed, to a 3D sketch, or a 3D mental image, which is like the mental image that we're conscious of. This is kind of like that. And what we become conscious of, that is occurring in this convergence zone, which is the global workspace. Um, even though, I think Dennett would say, even though Bars is not really committed to a special, one special area of the brain where the magic happens, or his rejection of what Dennett calls Cartesian daydreams. In spite of all that, he still thinks that at any given time, some things are in consciousness and some are not. As if consciousness is a place where things occur within. And that's not quite right. And it's an assumption that Dennett would say is indicative of this Cartesian materialism that he's critiquing, right? And a couple of other things that we ought to keep in mind. Global workspace theory, well, let's go back a few slides. This is one of those boxological diagrams, right, where we have different mechanisms or processes in these boxes, and the arrows represent the flow of information. And it might work as an information processing description. But one question is whether the brain is actually set up that way, right? So this gives us a picture of information processing on global workspace theory. But is it clear that these boxes represent discrete systems within the brain, and that the brain is actually organized that way? That is not a given, right? That takes some investigation. That's what neuroscientists are up to, right? Or maybe, like I said, there's a little bit of fruitful potential for crossover here with global workspace theory and with higher order thought or higher order perception theories. Maybe the brain doesn't have to be organized exactly the way that little flow chart lays out the information processing steps. Maybe what's important is that staircase analogy, right? We have hierarchical information processing systems, and when we get to the top, where maybe these representations are available for some system within the brain to have a higher order thought about or a higher order perception of, maybe that's when we become conscious of them. So, all of this leads to all kinds of questions, like whether it's entry into the global workspace. See, I'm doing it. I'm doing the Cartesian materialism. Does entry into the workspace make something conscious? Is it a consequence of something having become conscious? I try to avoid saying in and out of consciousness. Rather, I like to opt for becoming consciously aware of certain things, but I still make this mistake all the time. And that's why, I do believe that even though it doesn't work this way, it is intuitively appealing, to talk about things being in or out of consciousness. I have this habit of slipping back into talking about it that way, even though I don't actually believe it works that way. But I guess the big problem is really whether access to the global workspace or something, I can't, it's hard to talk about without saying something being in the global workspace. Does that explain qualia? What do you think? Yeah, doesn't seem to. Yeah, Hayden, on the global workspace theory, at least, yeah, that seems to be what's happening. If you're attending to something, I would say you're certainly conscious of it. And then to go like Bars on Bernard Bars's model, um, it's the broadcast from that spotlight of attention to the rest of the system that what something makes it so that we're conscious of something. Yeah. But qualia, do we think it deals with qualia? I don't think so. At least it doesn't seem to explain qualia. It explains maybe more about access consciousness than it does phenomenal consciousness, to use Ned Block's terminology. There are theories of consciousness that try and avoid the theater metaphor altogether. So, Benjamin Liebei's theory, it's a theory of neuronal adequacy, or his sort of time on theory of consciousness, where we become conscious of certain things when the neurons that realize those mental representations have been firing for long enough. Or there's Francis Crick's astonishing hypothesis. It avoids the theater metaphor. He writes, You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. But he still makes this comparison, as Barr does, of attention to a spotlight. Does that apply that he imply that he thinks there's a special stage or screen on which everything happens? Well, I don't know. Maybe it depends how you read Crick. Paul's and Patricia Churchland's eliminative materialism, however, also avoids the theater metaphor, and I think we ought to be pretty familiar with this idea, right? Theirs is a sort of identity theory, but it's like a reductionist, eliminativist version of identity theory, right? Paul Churchland doesn't deny that there are qualia, but he denies there is a problem of subjectivity, right? We've come across this quote before. For example, electromagnetic waves don't cause light. They're not correlated with light. They are light. That's what light is. Likewise with lightning, right? Um, Electricity is not correlated with lightning, doesn't cause lightning. Lightning is electricity, right? Something similar is going on with subjective consciousness, according to the Churchlands. Um, uh, and it sounds quite similar to Francis Crick's theory too, right? All of everything about my mental life, the me that I think I am, myself, my free will, my imaginings, my thoughts and beliefs and desires, all of this is just neurons firing, neurons organized in a certain way, firing in certain ways. All of this certainly avoids the worry of Cartesian materialism, um, but does it really help us overcome some of our problematic intuitions about the way consciousness works and the way subjectivity works? Does it dispel the intuitive appeal of the Cartesian theater? Uh, Maybe for some it does, and for others it doesn't. What I think it doesn't do is help us with qualia, right? Neurons firing, how can my experience of the redness of red just be neurons firing? And why is my experience of red, of the redness of red, the way it is, and not like something else? Why is redness red and not some other color? You can talk about the wavelengths of light and the firing frequencies of neurons that represent those wavelengths of light, but why is it red and not some other color? Right? The problem of subjectivity remains. I don't know. What do you think? Like we said last time, I think it was Leo, right? If I look at a yellow object and then you look inside my brain, you're not going to find anything yellow in those neurons firing. Like, and this is kind of what Leibniz is trying to illustrate with with Leibniz's mill, right? We just see mechanical parts pushing and pulling. We just see neurons talking to one another with electrochemical signals. We don't see anything yellow when I look at a yellow object. If we look in the brain, there's nothing yellow in there. So why is it the way it is? The problem of subjectivity remains. Oh, but feel free to disagree with me. I don't know. What do you think? Do any of these theories appeal to you thus far? I know I'm just giving you a sort of whistle stop tour of all these different theories. But I'm kind of wondering what you're thinking so far. Like, am I maybe more of a global workspace theorist? Am I maybe more of an eliminativist like the Churchlands? Or maybe, hey, to heck with it. I'm still going to be a Cartesian. Why not? What do we think? Let's get some discussion going. It's so hard to. I have no clue what I am anymore. Same. Um, I just know that I'm not a Cartesian ego. Whatever I am, I'm not what I think I am. I guess you could call me an illusionist with respect to the self. Yeah, Blorp. I've got those Zorp matrices firing. Hayden's still into the dualism, which I mean that's fine. I'm not a dualist, but I want to reiterate that I'm not trying to tell you what to think. Um, and I understand the intuitive appeal of dualism. I certainly do. Joshua is still in the realm of physicalism, but a confused one. Hey, fair enough. I mean, I'm not going to lie. Like the first time I started reading about this consciousness stuff, it took me a while to really digest it. You kind of have to savor all of this with, like the way you savor a nice meal or something, right? You don't want to rush through it. Lee says, I'm not sure, but I'm despairing there's ever going to be an answer to this discrepancy between the physical brain and subjectivity. Yeah. You're not alone. You're not alone, Lee. And who had their hand up? Hayden, I think, had their hand up, their virtual hand.
Yeah, that was me. I was just I wanted to clarify on the dualism thing. I don't necessarily think that like I wouldn't say I'm necessarily a substance dualist or anything, but I do think that like the mind and the brain are useful to talk about as separate things because I don't like eliminative materialism exactly yet, so I don't know.
Yeah, it sounds more like you're leaning toward property dualism.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah,
But
like,
I like epiphenomenalism too, and I have to defend it for my final paper still,
oh,
so
nice. You like it? I mean, you don't find it worrying?
I no, I don't okay, I wouldn't say I like it, but I find it convincing. I just find it convincing.
Yeah, that's why I find it worrying. I think this is really convincing, but then what happens to my agency, right? Um,
Yeah.
It's a worry. It is a worry. Like I told you, Kim seems worried about it. I'm worried about it too. But fair. Liam says Cartesian theater requires substance dualism as you need an observer. Yeah, yeah. And that's Dennett's main gripe. Like a lot of what we're working with here, what Blackmore is working with, is drawn from Dennett's Consciousness Explained. And in Consciousness Explained, he sets up his theory, multiple drafts, in opposition to not Cartesian dualism, but Cartesian materialism, which centers around this theater metaphor, right? And speaking of Dennett, let's talk about multiple drafts because I actually really like this. Dennett writes in Consciousness Explained, when you discard Cartesian dualism, you really must discard the show that would have gone on in the Cartesian theater, and the audience as well. For neither the show nor the audience is to be found in the brain, and the brain is the only real place there is to look for them. Dennett is what I like to call an intuition buster, right? He has his thought experiments, he has his intuition pumps, but a lot of what he does is also aimed at busting our poor intuitions about how things work based on how it seems to us. And so his whole project is about dispelling these Cartesian materialist intuitions. Some even call him the devil, right? Um, some accuse him of not explaining consciousness, but rather explaining away consciousness. And perhaps that's a fair criticism. But to sort of counter Cartesian materialism, he's proposed this multiple drafts theory. All kinds of mental activity, from our perceptions, sensations, perceptions, thoughts, which include beliefs and desires, our emotions and our moods, um, any kind of mental activity that you can think of. All of this is accomplished by lots and lots of different processes operating in parallel with one another. We're talking about sensory systems interpreting sensory signals, perceptual systems taking the outputs from those systems and forming more complicated mental representations. We're talking about mental events interacting with other mental events. Beliefs and desires interacting produce action. All of these are constantly going on. All of these you can think of as like lots of different drafts of a book that are always being edited, revised, altered, and probed by other processes. So at any given time, then it would say there are these multiple drafts going on that are at different stages of editing in different parts of the brain. You follow me so far? If not, we can make this more concrete. Lee's got it. I'm gonna try and make it more concrete, all the same. At this time, you've got auditory information entering your ears, going through your auditory nerves to your temporal areas. In parallel to that, your visual systems are working. In parallel to that, you have like other more inner processes, like maybe you're thinking of what I'm saying. All of these things are going on at the same time, as if every part of the brain that's doing something is constantly writing and editing the draft of the story of your conscious experience. Now, these processes can be probed by other processes. But it's a mistake to ask which of the processes are conscious and which are not. No. None of this is presented to a self or an audience member in the Cartesian theater or to one's mind eye or to some homunculus in a giant fleshy robot. There are just all these different drafts continuously being written, rewritten, and edited all the time. This sense that we have a stream of consciousness or the sense that it occurs on a stage or a screen happens when one stream probes another or multiple others. And some of these drafts could be used when we're producing actions too, like moving about, decide, and acting intentionally, speaking. But a lot fade away. And your conscious experience just is whatever is going on at that stage of editing when it's probed by other processes that are working in parallel. Yes, actually, we do have uh, narratives. We do have narratives. Um, Dennett actually has an interesting narrative theory of the self, where selves don't really exist, but selves are like characters that our mind writes into its own story about itself. Lee, if you're interested in this, there's a chapter by Maria Schechtman in the Oxford Handbook of the Self that I think you would like. She discusses Dennett's theory in that chapter. Yeah. Um, well, that's the way it seems, Liam. Um, what you are conscious of is just that. What you are conscious of is like where that draft is in that stage of editing at the time it's probed by another process. But it is very parallel, right? It's like I tried to describe it earlier. It's about many parallel systems working in concert with one another, but there's no special time and place where it all comes together. Rather, it depends upon which streams are probing other streams. Does that make sense? And like, I'm not saying there are multiple versions of what you hear. What you hear is one snapshot of one draft that you happen to attend to, right? Does that make sense? We're not conscious of all the drafts anyway. That's certainly not what Dennett means, not what I mean to imply either. We're not conscious of the many drafts, but of the multiple drafts. But if we probe a draft at a particular stage of editing, that is what our conscious experience is of. Yeah, yeah, yeah. A lot of these drafts, like most of this, is unconscious. Leo says, when I have a thought, I have to translate it from abstract nonverbal version into actual language to try and give it shape. Would that be like editing the draft of the thought, or I am completely off? That's editing a draft, I would think. Um, and look, like Dennett's theory is probably the one that you need to sit with the most for the longest time. You know, but yeah, like these nonverbal abstract thoughts are results of some systems probing other systems at a particular time, which then get probed by other systems, which allow you to articulate it in a certain way, and out comes your utterance that expresses your thought. But it could have happened some other way. And there's no special time and place where it all came together. Lee says, I think it's like multiple drafts being written underwater and some of the pages float up to the surface and then some float up. That's a really interesting way of putting it. Yeah, but I see what you're doing there, Lee. Yeah. Um, the drafts that are floating to the surface are the ones that are probed by other drafts. The ones that float away, just, they're gone into the stream of consciousness, as it were. Here's an example. Imagine you're looking out the window and you see a bird fly past. Your conclusion is that you consciously saw the bird, right? But that's a result of probing your stream of multiple drafts at this one point that you did, but you could have done it at any number of possible points. So there's no actual experience of seeing the bird in the sense, because there's no screen on which it happened. Um, your actual experience of seeing the bird is just contingent on what was probed when, right? Conscious contents, Dennett says, can arise, get revised, affect behavior, and leave traces in memory. And it comes to seem that there's this Cartesian theater when really it's not. It's not that way. It just seems that way. And so, Dennett says, we must not make the mistake of supposing that there are facts, unrecoverable but actual facts, about just which contents were conscious and which were not at the time. These are not part of, these are not those kinds of things, Dennett says. And this is what I meant last time when I said that, Dennett kind of quines all of this away. Um, what did you experience when the bird flew past the window? There's no right answer because there's no show, no theater, and no audience. It's not like, I guess the easiest way to put it is that you are not the audience and your consciousness is not what's happening on the stage or screen. You and your experience are just part of this incredibly complicated, massively parallel system of drafts that are being edited, updated, and revised in concert with one another. Kind of like I said at the beginning of the course following Kim, as he says in chapter 2, you don't have a mind, you are your mind, right? Any questions? We're really flying through this material. I think we are going to finish early. But I want to make sure I'm not going too fast with the multiple draft stuff. Lee likes the draft theory. I do too. I do too. First time I encountered it, I was like, what? But now I'm like really into it. I think I'm a bit of a Dennett disciple when it comes to multiple drafts. Not I don't agree with him on everything, but I do like multiple drafts. Uh, no, the drafts are the drafts are physically realized by neuronal activity in the brain. But the drafts as we're discussing them would be mental representations. Yeah. But they have a physical basis. Yeah. Okay, Liam says, it seems unintuitive. Parallelism is proven in the mind, but my unconscious having multiple iterations seems redundant and against the heuristic model of neurons. If the other drafts are merely the possibilities that could be in the heuristics, then that makes sense. But if they are all simultaneously represented in neurons, well, they're not. They're not simultaneously represented. Um, apologies if I'm not explaining this correctly, but what Dennett is saying is that these parallel processes, these are the drafts. Um, so you don't have multiple iterations. You have a continuously updated draft in one system and likewise in another system and another and another. What you're conscious of just depends on how all of these parallel processes are like talking to one another. Does that make sense? So it's not like I'm saving multiple drafts and I have multiple different drafts about the same sort of thing. I have multiple continuous drafts like that are like maybe for in my visual system I say let's simplify it and say for my visual system I have a visual draft. For my auditory system I have an auditory draft. For my reasoning areas, I have a reasoning draft. I'm very much oversimplifying, but so that's 3 example drafts, and they are all continuously being written, revised, and edited. And what consciousness seems to be like depends on how they're all talking to one another. Does that make sense? Josh says, yeah. Yeah, maybe the word draft is a little misleading. But yeah, multiple models could work. Um, yeah. Liam, remind me, are you a computer science person or a neuroscience person? Okay, yeah, okay. I see. Yeah, I see what you're saying now. Yeah, like a model or objects maybe. Maybe I have objects that are constantly updating. But yeah, I see what I see. I see. Um, I think you do. I think you have grasped it though. Yeah, I understand, Lee. Yeah, like for me, I'm more of a language person, right? So I'm like, oh, drafts, right? Yeah, I got it. Liam, you also got it. I think you're thinking about it like a computer scientist, which is fine, which is fine. But you do understand it. You do get it. Yeah. Ah, someone has to put that on a shirt. Amazing. Incidentally, since Lee, I know you're writing your paper on the self, and maybe some of you are also interested in selves and personal identity, and so you might all find something interesting in Dennett's theory of personhood. Dennett argues that when a portion of the world comes to compose the skein of narratives, narratives might be higher order drafts about a person. That is the observer. So the observer, there's no self like a Cartesian ego or a soul. The self is more like a center of narrative gravity for Dennett. It's an abstract thing. Different streams of process, different streams are probed, different models are probed, if you want to put it that way. And there is an illusion created of there being an author and an observer, but and that is all taking place in the theater, but it's not. It just comes to seem that way. So Dennett's theory explains why consciousness seems the way it does, but does it deal with subjectivity? Well, again, Dennett denies. Well, Dennett quines away the notion of qualia as real things that we can know facts about, right? He says here, what about the actual phenomenology? There's no such thing. And that's why a lot of Dennett's critics say he hasn't explained consciousness, he's explained it away, right? But remember, he's not denying that subjective experiences happen, but he thinks that we're mistaken about the ways we think about them. Or rather, we're mistaken about the nature of subjective experiences owing to the way what it's like to have them makes it seem like the mind is like, if I can put it that way. And if you find, Blackmore says, if you find Dennett's alternative account difficult and worrying, then you're probably beginning to understand it. So, good. But what do we think? I mean, I know I have so Lee, Liam, maybe a few others are getting it and are into it. I'm into it. I like multiple drafts. Do I want to quine away my beliefs about qualia? I don't know. When I think if I understand Dennett properly, when he says there's no actual phenomenology, he's not saying there's no subjective experience. He's saying that subjective experience misleads us as to the nature of how subjective experience actually works. Um, and these qualia are not part of the external world, and they're the result of streams or models probing other streams or other models or other drafts at different points in time when it could have been otherwise. So qualia aren't the sort of thing that there can be objective facts about. That's how I understand him. Of course, I'm worried that I misunderstand him, but maybe, as Blackmore says, that worry just indicates that I am understanding him. I'm not sure. I want to talk about the hard problem of consciousness, but would we like another quick break to sort of sit with what we've discussed in terms of multiple draft theory and global workspace, et cetera, et cetera? I hope I'm not taking too many breaks. Okay. I always feel like if I take too many breaks, like I'm wasting, like this is supposed to be a 3 hour class. You guys pay good money to be here, but well, Lee says yes, please. So and sure, and Liam and Hayden say sure. So yeah, let's say I have 422 on my microwave. So we'll come back at 432, and then we'll just talk about the hard problem and the easy problems, and then that's it. Yeah, I agree, Lee. I feel like if I just lecture at you for 3 hours straight with no discussion, I'm not really teaching you if I do that. That would be like the COVID days when my lectures were pre-recorded and I'm just talking to a camera for 3 hours. I don't know how helpful those were. I think certainly my videos were of better quality, but I don't know if the teaching was. So I'll see you all in 10 minutes. All right. Let's begin again. Um, yeah, Liam, a couple more things here. Global workspace theory seems to just be multiple drafts, but breaking down the drafts. Seeing the mind as one model instead of multiple models with a superstructure connecting them, allowing them to interact on their own. I suppose the difference is that Barr carves out space for consciousness in that things can be in or out, whereas Dennett says the interactions of the drafts is consciousness. Um, yeah, I would say that's that seems like a pretty good summary of how we can compare these two different theories. Um, I guess because Dennett is really, really concerned with avoiding the theater metaphor. Barr seems a bit less concerned about it. But yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. All right, I want to finish off by giving a little bit of discussion or holding a little bit of discussion on the idea of the hard problem of consciousness, which Kim discusses, Blackmore discusses. Again, I'm leaning more on Blackmore here, but the hard problem, recall, is the problem of explaining how um, these physical processes in the brain, which we can objectively observe, give rise to subjective consciousness, give rise to subjective experience, or to phenomenal consciousness in Bloch's terminology. So it's related to Nagel's question, what is it like to be a bat, right? It's also related to the mind-body problem, and it's related to some of the thought experiments we've covered in this course too. Um, let's differentiate the hard problem from the easy problems. Can anyone give me an example of what Chalmers thinks of as an easy problem in philosophy of mind or cognitive science? We could probably come up with a few of these. So if you're a cognitive science student, I suspect you have a good grasp of many of the easy problems, which we've actually solved over the years. Or even if you're a psychology student, you'll have a good grasp of many of the easy problems. But what are easy problems? Easy problems are problems we can solve with the tools of the cognitive sciences. So maybe we have an example here in the chat. Yeah. Um, in a sense, Lee, yeah. Like what nervous tissue is active when we experience pain? Well, we can look and see that it's C fibers firing. A hard problem would be like, why does pain feel the way it is, or the way it does? That would be a hard problem. Other easy problems would be like how attention works. How does working memory work? Um, these are all easy problems, right? What parts of the brain are active during which cognitive processes? Well, we can look and we can see. We can observe using functional magnetic resonance imaging that when I'm looking at something, my visual areas are active. And when I'm listening to something, my auditory areas are active, right? And we can see where those are located. They're located in the occipital and temporal areas, respectively. Well, there is one hard problem, Liam, but there are many, many easy problems, is what I'm saying. But the hard problem overall, like the general hard problem, is how do all of these material or physical processes give rise to subjective consciousness? So it's related to Nagel's question about subjectivity, and it's related to the mind-body interaction problem. In fact, it's just another version of the mind-body interaction problem, right? I mean, the hard problem is, um, why am I conscious? How does my brain do that? And as Chalmers says in his famous song, The Zombie Blues, what consciousness is, I ain't got a clue, because I got a case of the zombie blues. By the way, if you can find any videos of Chalmers performing that, you really should. It's quite something. uh, so, how could we respond to the hard problem? Well, some say that we're not ever going to solve it. I think that's what some of you were despairing about in the chat earlier, right? The hard problem is insoluble. We will never solve it. William James thought maybe we'd never solve it. And these new Mysterians, as Owen Flanagan calls them, think that maybe the problem is insoluble for any number of reasons, right? Colin McGinn thinks that we aren't cognitively equipped to solve the problem. We are not sophisticated enough to figure out how it works, right? Well, that might explain why we have consciousness, Liam, but how it works is a different question, right? We can say, well, I can explain consciousness by, in the sense of like why? Like, why is there consciousness? Well, creatures on Earth evolved consciousness perhaps to deal with novel threats, novel situations, etc. Or maybe more broadly, because consciousness confers some kind of adaptive advantage to organisms that have it. I mean, think about being a human versus being a creature that's, if arguably not conscious or much less conscious than we are. I was watching a clip from a BBC Earth documentary last night on YouTube, actually, about Antarctica and about how there's all kinds of life underneath the ice sheets in the winter in Antarctica. All these jellyfish and starfish, which I think can sense their environment and act within it. But if there is anything that it's like to be a starfish, it's probably not as rich as what it's like to be a human in terms of phenomenology. So I'm not going to say they're not conscious, but maybe less conscious. Anyway, what happens in Antarctica is they get these things called brinicles. The water under the ice is actually much warmer than the air above. But sometimes these brinicles can form, these ice, like underwater icicles that reach down and touch the bottom, and along them cold water flows, and it can freeze organisms in this area. Um, and these creatures are not cognitively sophisticated enough to recognize when this is happening before it's too late, right? They can feel it getting cold in their immediate vicinity, and if they're lucky, they might get out of the way. But they don't have sophisticated inner representations of natural phenomena like brinicles, right? So a human can deal with a sort of threat in the environment in a way that a starfish can't, owing in part due to consciousness, right? That's why. That's a why explanation. But then, of course, starfish are quite successful. They seem to do quite well without being conscious. And even if we say that we have evolved consciousness because because it confers some kind of adaptive benefit, that doesn't explain how it works, right? And that's what the hard problem is about. I think that Chalmers would certainly agree that consciousness is an evolved trait that confers advantages to us. But does it explain qualia? No. It doesn't explain how. It explains why, but it doesn't explain how. But yeah, maybe like McGinn says, we're just not cognitively equipped to solve this problem. My cat is not cognitively equipped to take this philosophy class, right? Similarly, I am not cognitively equipped to figure out how consciousness works. Steven Pinker says maybe we can understand how minds work, but our understanding of phenomenal consciousness is going to be forever beyond our conceptual grasp. Yeah, I agree. He can try. um, I think cats are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. That's for sure, right? I mean, I think people's intuitions are that dogs are more intelligent and that dogs love us more because we can train them. But then I've had a vet say to me, like, well, actually, what cats do is they train us. Um, because I had to bring my fat cat to the vet. And the vet was like, you got to get him to lose some weight. And I said, well, of course. She said, I know it's hard. You know, after all, they train us to feed them. I was like, yeah, he kind of does, doesn't he? Um, so yeah, like Lee says, depends on the cat. Yeah, maybe the cat already knows. I wouldn't put it past him. Solve the hard problem, but won't tell me. That's a very cat thing to do. Um, like McGinn or Pinker, we'll never solve it. I don't want to believe that. I want to believe that we'll figure it out. And again, in Kim, toward the end of Kim, chapter 10, he talks about whether he talks about reductionism, but not reductionism in terms of identities, but in terms of functions, like a functional reduction. And Kim seems optimistic about being able to do this with access consciousness, but not phenomenal consciousness. Yeah, yeah, Liam. Maybe that's why the ancient Egyptians worshipped him. They knew that the cats knew something they didn't. Um, so yeah, I don't want to believe that we'll never solve this problem. I understand the worry. So that's option number one. The hard problem is insoluble. Option number two, we should try and solve it. Well, yeah. See, if only access consciousness can be functionally reduced, we're still not solving the hard problem because the hard problem is about phenomenal consciousness. Yeah. So we might be able to understand the role that consciousness plays in reasoning and in rationally guiding speech and action, but we might not ever understand why the redness of red is the way red appears and not some other way. It's phenomenal consciousness that's the really mysterious one. Yeah. But we could just go ahead and try and solve the problem. That's option number two. Chalmers' solution is this sort of dual aspect theory. Um, so this is kind of like a property dualism, right? Information has two aspects. There's physical information and perhaps experiential or mental information or mental properties and physical properties. Um, William James advocated for something similar, a sort of neutral monism, where which really is I think I understand as a sort of property dualism where we have one kind of thing, one kind of substance, physical substance, but it has physical and mental properties. Mathematician named Chris Clark thinks that mind is actually an aspect of the universe. Um, this is called panpsychism. So panpsychism means from pan meaning all and psyche meaning soul. So like space and time are aspects of the universe, so is mind. Mm, Sounds pretty cool, but it also sounds a little bit like magic. Yeah. Yeah, Lee. Yeah, that also kind of reminds me of a sort of dual aspect or neutral monism or property dualism sort of approach. Yeah, Liam, so panpsychism I think says that everything in the world has a little bit of mentality, but maybe when things are sophisticated enough you get like a full-blown mind. I don't know, it seems to imply to me that like if panpsychism is true, then is there something that it's like to be a rock? It seems like that's what it implies. Bad news for vegetarians, right? If you, or vegans, if you want to avoid if the reason why you don't eat animals or animal products is to minimize suffering to the animals and then you only eat plant-based things. Well, if panpsychism is true, there might be something that it's like to be a plant or to be a mushroom, and you might be causing untold suffering by eating your vegetables. I mean, I'm not being facetious. Is that might be an implication of panpsychism? Yeah, yeah, like that, Leo. That's a good way of putting it. Like the more mass you have, the more gravity you have. Maybe the way that my matter is put together, like in a brain, means I have more mind than a rock. Yeah. Well, problem of subjectivity, plant version, right? Maybe there is something it's like to be that sunflower following the sun across the sky, but just like with Nagel's bats, how could we ever know what that's like, right? Roger Penrose has an interesting answer to the hard problem. He says that consciousness depends on non-algorithmic processes. So Roger Penrose is not a computationalist, right? And he and Stuart Hameroff have actually developed this theory where they propose that conscious experience is a quality of space-time. So it's kind of panpsychism, kind of. It's related to all this quantum stuff happening in the brain, quantum theory. I actually think that this does not help. Um, well, the whole plant screaming thing, I think I know what you're saying, Liam. Yeah, plants emit chemicals when they've been damaged to indicate to other plants that they have been damaged. I think calling that plants screaming was problematic science journalism. Um, yeah, the question really is, oh, ultrasonic sounds? Oh, interesting. But is that because they're experiencing pain? Ultrasonic, yeah. Is that because they're experiencing pain? How could we know, right? The only reason we don't think there's anything it's like to be a sunflower is because sunflowers are so physiologically different to us that we can't conceive of a conscious sunflower. Like the whole spectrum of conscious to unconscious beings is based on ourselves, right? Yeah, maybe we're being a little anthropocentric, right? After all, for a long time, many people did not believe that animals were conscious. But now most of us acknowledge that they are, right? Like Descartes called animals beast machines. And if you kick a dog and it yelps, it's not because it experiences pain. It is because it acts from the disposition of its organs. It's an automaton, right? But now we acknowledge that uh, dogs and other non-human animals are conscious. They're sentient. They experience pain and pleasure. Yeah, and maybe Liam, you could be right. Like one day we might realize plants experience pain. And so maybe now I'm like Descartes was with respect to animals. Maybe I'm being like that with plants. I'm willing to entertain the possibility at any rate. Um, yeah. And then what do we do? bad luck. Nothing to eat. Um, yeah, panic hunger strike. Um, yeah, that's true. Maybe it's so, like Liam says, if we apply the gravity analogy, it could be that maybe it's okay. Um, anyway, like I was saying, Penrose's and Hameroff's theory invokes quantum physics to explain experience as an aspect of space-time. I tend to think that is like swapping one mystery for another. And I go on a similar rant in my philosophy of the paranormal class, but we don't fully understand how quantum physics actually works. So using it to explain consciousness, another thing we don't exactly know how it works. Well, we're just solving one mystery with another mystery, and I'm not sure how helpful that is. This is not to disparage Penrose. Penrose is a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He's a hell of a lot smarter than I am. But I do think that swapping one mystery for another isn't really going to explain anything for us, right? So, on all of these, we can solve the hard problem, but we need to fundamentally rethink what we think we know about the universe. The third option, try and solve the easy problems. Maybe we can solve the hard problem, maybe we can't, but we're not in a position to solve it now. So let's focus on the easy problems. And those are the ones we can solve with the tools of the cognitive sciences. And one task we might start with, or that we've been doing for a long time, is identifying neural correlates of consciousness. Right? That's part of the easy problem. Like I said earlier, looking at what parts of the brain are active when we're engaged in which kinds of cognitive tasks. Right? When we're conscious, what parts of the brains are active versus when we're unconscious, like when we're asleep, when we're under anesthesia. That might help us solve some of these easy problems, and we'll work our way toward the hard problem incrementally. And finally, maybe there is no hard problem. That's what O'Hara and Scott say. There is no hard problem of consciousness. It just seems like there is. What we actually need to do is address the easy problems, because that's what we know how to do. Solutions to the easy problems might change how we understand the hard problem. If we try and solve the hard problem now, we're getting off to a premature start. And even if we are able to solve it, a solution would only be useful to us if we can recognize it as a solution to the hard problem. And right now, we probably couldn't recognize such a solution if we wanted to, because we don't understand enough about subjective consciousness. So it's a bit like Elan Vital, right? People evoked this idea of Elan Vital to explain life, as if there was a hard problem of life. But by solving easy problems like figuring out the structure of DNA and how DNA transcription works, how folding proteins work, how cell division works, how the theory of evolution explains life and genetics. By solving all these easy problems, the hard problem of life disappeared. And we don't need Elan Vital to explain life. Maybe something similar will happen with consciousness. This is how Dennett does it. Anyway, he actually likens Chalmers's view of the hard problem to that of a vitalist, someone who appeals to this notion of Elan Vital to explain life. You might say, like, even if we explain reproduction, metabolism, growth, all of those easy problems, the hard problem of life itself would remain. But would it really? Dennett continues that Chalmers's hard problem is a theorist's illusion, something inviting therapy, not a real problem to be solved with a revolutionary new science. So maybe we're thinking about consciousness in the wrong way. That is what Dennett says when consciousness is a mystery, and mysteries are something we don't yet know how to think about. So instead of trying to solve the hard problem, let's explain how consciousness comes to seem the way it is. And that's all I have for you today. Questions? Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Liam. One extra question from Lee regarding the earlier potential solution. Quantum physics only explains things at a very, very, very tiny molecular level anyway. Yeah, we are made up of vast numbers of atoms, which is a whole different level of complexity. Yeah, I agree. And besides, I mean, one of the reasons why quantum physics is still mysterious is because we don't know how to reconcile quantum physics with relativity, right? Quantum physics is for things that happen at very small scales over very short periods of time, and relativity is about what happens at very large scales. Um, we don't know how to reconcile the two. Yeah. And so we're switching one mystery for another, right? Um, Tomorrow's class, it says this is the end here. And thank you all. I do mean that. This has been fun. I always like teaching this course. And thanks especially to all of you who are able to be here every day. I know some of you can't be here because you have jobs and you get sick and you get busy, you visit family. That's fine. But there is a good chunk of this class that doesn't show up to the live lectures, and that's always a bit of a drag. So I want to thank all of you that have made an effort to be here and participate, to actively participate. Thank you very much for doing that. It makes teaching a summer course online a heck of a lot easier when I have that kind of active participation. Yeah. Yeah, Josh, you're right. I think you're right. But astrophysicists and theoretical, they're all interested in this. They'd all be happy if we figured it out, right? Um, so I've had a lot of fun. This is an absolute pleasure. I'm so lucky that I get to do this. I'm a lucky guy. We still have one more class though. That's tomorrow. And what I think I'm going to do is just kind of be available to answer your questions. No, it's Thursday. Yeah, it's Thursday. It's a weird day. But anyway, what I'm going to do is be here to answer any questions you have about anything, whether it's what we've learned about, whether it's an assignment that you're working on, like your essays. Predominantly, I expect I'll be answering questions about essays, right? But I'll also answer questions like if you have any questions or concerns about anything you've learned, like you're not quite sure you've got a handle on it, I'll be doing that. And I imagine we won't go for 3 hours, but I'll try to go for like an hour and a half. So please come. And yeah, that's what we'll do for the last class. We'll just kind of wrap up, discuss things, and I'll answer questions. Uh, Liam has one more question. What is the difference between a plant and a rock? This question seems to highlight the difference in what we consider living and non-living. So for me, it makes more sense to say that the more complex the system, the more conscious. Yeah, I would say sure, that's fair, right? Even if panpsychism, so if panpsychism is true, I would say that rocks still have little mentality, but trees have more, maybe. Right? Yeah. So maybe we can talk about this more next time once we've kind of digested all of this consciousness stuff. But for now, that's all. I think I'm going to go and get rested up for tomorrow to answer all of your questions. But I just want to say thanks again for such a good course, and please do, if you can, come to class tomorrow, and be my pleasure to help address whatever questions you might have. So I will see you tomorrow, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you.